Thank you very much for talking to us. So you're kind of recently announcing that you're leaving your role, and it feels to me like your kind of parting message is that ideology is at the heart of terrorism. I just wondered if you could explain what you mean by that.
Well, yeah, so first of all, great to be with you. Secondly, we have recently produced a study which looked at 100 convicted terrorists over the course of some 2 decades and over 6,000 pieces of electronic material they collected. And what this study demonstrated is that terrorists don't just dabble with ideology, they immerse themselves in it, they take it seriously, they try and understand it. And this gets to a tension that has existed in the field of terrorism and extremism for some time, as to what extent do the power of ideas drive people's actions as opposed to other factors such as socioeconomics. Now, that's not to say there is no role for personal factors, because clearly they are in the mix with ideas as well. But what this study shows is that ideology is absolutely central to explaining why terrorists do the things they do.
It feels like your emphasis is quite different from the government's. They're talking about, lone wolf terrorism being on the rise. The nature of terrorism has changed, according to the Prime Minister. Do you think there is a bit of a conflict there?
Well, I think that this research actually is really helpful to government because it's so evidence-driven. It's based on case studies. It's not based on hypotheticals. It's based on decades of experience.
But do you agree with the government that the nature of terrorism has changed, or do you think that actually they're wrong?
Well, it gets to the question about what we're talking about, and I think this has been really brought into stark focus by the debate over Rudakubana, which has led to
the Southport killer.
The Southport killer, about whether this was terrorism or whether, in the words of the Independent Reviewer of Terrorism legislation, it was violence that terrorises. Because there are very different consequences to the answer to that question. If you consider Rudakubana to be a terrorist, then there is a whole counter-terrorism apparatus which comes into play. But my suggestion on that would be that you would potentially overwhelm the system, and the authorities wouldn't have the capacity to be able to deal with the risk of all individuals out there who are, let's say, fixated in violence but have mental health issues. My concern would be you would create so many haystacks that you wouldn't be able to find the needle anymore.
So just to be clear, you think then that actually Axel Rudakubana, the Southport killer, shouldn't be classified as a terrorist?
Well, I don't think he meets any definition of terrorism that I have seen. Obviously it's a live conversation, and honest people can disagree on this. And obviously the act of violence in Southport was so horrendous that I understand the need for people to attach what they feel like can be the most serious label to it. But just because, let's say, if Rudakubana is not considered a terrorist, that doesn't make the act of violence any less serious. It doesn't mean we should treat it any less seriously. It just means it doesn't necessarily fit into the counter-terrorism model we currently have.
One of the things that came out was that he watched a lot of extreme violent material online. I just wonder if, that kind of falls into the terrorism category, because it's almost like, could he have been radicalised to have an ideology online himself? Or do you just think is it just unhelpful to even bring terrorism into it?
Well, he did look at content we would consider terrorism, like Al-Qaeda manuals, Al-Qaeda content. But he also looked at a whole range of other things. He looked at provisional IRA content, he looked at content to do with genocide. It was this whole diverse range of grim topics, essentially.
It's almost like he was obsessed with violence.
He was fixated with violence, but he didn't have the ideological framework attached to it. And I think that creates a real challenge for the preventative system in general, because if you're looking to divert that person away from committing an act of violence, if they don't have an ideological framework attached to them, how do you begin to have that conversation? What is it you're essentially trying to divert them away from? It's not like an Islamist ideology or an extreme right-wing ideology. It's an obsessiveness with violence for the sake of it. And that, I think, is those sorts of people fixated with violence have long existed, but now, of course, they have access to nihilistic chat forums, or they have access to terrorist manuals online, and it obviously makes it a slightly different challenge to the ones in the past.
I thought it was interesting when you were talking about prevent just being overwhelmed if the definition is too broad. I mean, do you think that prevent is fit for purpose?
Yeah, I think prevent is a really important part of our counter-terrorism apparatus. It's a getting to people, trying to divert people away early from committing acts of terrorism seems to me to be one of the most vital things you could do. I've also said prevent is not unimprovable, and there was an independent review at the start of 2023 that outlined dozens of recommendations. They've since been implemented. There is an independent commissioner for prevent, Lord Anderson, who's been appointed, who is also going to look to refine the system. But I would support refining what prevent does. I think clearly there are improvements to be made, but I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I do think it's an important programme.
How much of a threat is Islamic terrorism?
Well, it remains the key terrorism threat we face today. If you look at the counter-terrorism police or MI5 casework, Islamist terrorism remains the driving force. It's interesting because we talk a lot about the diversification of the terrorism threat, diversification of extremism. Those things are true, they are. But if you look at the day in, day out threat to life in this country, Islamist terrorism remains the driving force. It's been the case for the 4 years I've been in this job, and it's also been the case for a couple of decades beforehand.
Do you think the security risk has changed because of what we've seen in Gaza?
Yeah, well, I think that what happened in Gaza was potentially seismic in terms of its impact for the threat landscape in the UK. I think what was uncorked, essentially, by what happened in Gaza, some of the sentiments we saw being aired about Jewish people in the aftermath was, I can't say it surprised me, but I understand it shocked many people the way it played out. Of course, there was a pre-existing, well-entrenched Islamist terror threat facing this country, but I think what happened in Gaza has amplified that. I think the consequences of it are going to be played out for years to come, similarly to the way in which other major terrorist attacks, 9/11, the July 2005 bombings in London, had a major impact on security for years to come. I would expect similar to happen in the post-7/10 landscape.
It's interesting to hear you say that. It's almost like the kind of horrors that happen and radicalise people as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, the grim truth is around this is that after 9/11, the threat landscape increased. Now, most people, the vast majority of people in the world, see these sorts of terrorist attacks and are repulsed by them. But to the terrorist groups who mean us harm, it's a fantastic shot in the arm because it shows, look, we can hurt the West, we can hit the West. Their security architecture isn't infallible. We can pull these things off. And we've seen it again and again. I mean, United States, Europe, Israel, Australia, I mean, that terrorism takes place all over the world, and it acts as a driver when the West especially gets hit in the way it does.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.